Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that, no matter what the conversation is, you are armed with facts, data, and some, perhaps even courage to, engage those who seem to be just part of the echo chamber out there. You may not have noticed this because there was something or another going on that may have distracted you from this news, but on November 4th, something really important happened. No, we didn't find out who the president-elect was. And remember, elections that last for more than 4 hours should be treated by a physician. No, I'm talking about the end of the Paris Climate Accord, or the U.S. participation in it, happened on November 4th. And to take us inside this, because I think this may be even more seminal than the presidential election that took place on November 3rd. Hayden Ludwig with the Capital Research Center is on with us this week. Hayden, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
Great. Good to be with you again. Thank you.
So, November 4th, the U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Accord finally expires. And people may hear the phrase, especially if they consume talk radio, maybe not so much if they watch NBC News, but the Paris Climate Accord is a treaty that was never treated as a treaty because the U.S. Senate never got a chance to vote on it. It was just something we agreed to participate in, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think we should refresh people's memories because a lot of people are going to be listening thinking they're having deja vu that, wait, didn't we pull out of this last year? We should clarify that what happened in 2019, November 4th, 2019, President Trump submitted his formal withdrawal letter to the Paris Climate Accord officials, which means that it took effect exactly 1 year after the fact. Last Wednesday, we officially withdrew. We keep calling this the Accord. It should be called a treaty that wasn't really a treaty. This whole thing was a massive global elitist, global warming scheme, conned basically on every nation on the planet the United States just withdrew from. And the goal was basically to stave off global warming, as they all told us. But in point of fact, actually, what it was an enormous, unprecedentedly enormous wealth redistribution on a scale we've never seen before, pulling from low-carbon emitting countries like the United States and Europe and Japan, and basically paying off huge climate, quote-unquote, polluters, because I hate that phrase, but polluters like India and China. But this was negotiated as a foreign treaty by the Obama administration in 2015 when it was all put together. But, of course, it was never brought before the Republican-controlled Senate because we think the Obama administration rightly believes that the Republicans and many Democrats wouldn't have supported it in the Senate. And this is critical because Democrats internally negotiated this. In fact, we know that many left-wing environmental groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, groups like that, actually advised their friends in the Obama administration to negotiate this as a foreign treaty, but then don't sell the American public on as a foreign treaty. Call it an agreement, because the Constitution, of course, requires that all formal treaties go before the United States Senate for ratification, right? So they basically just conned us into joining this whole thing that President Trump finally withdrew us from last week.
Now, as the participation expires, it also, I think, is fair to remind people that nothing proposed in here would have changed the temperature of the water or the temperature of an ice cap or the survivability of a polar bear one iota. This was really about, as you pointed out, India and China getting status as a developing nation rather than a world superpower, especially economically, as they are.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of studies out there right now, and of course you can make studies that say whatever you want, but some friendly groups like the Heritage Foundation have put together studies using models from the U.S. Department of Energy, so official U.S. government models, and they basically concluded that the U.S. currently is emits about 15% of all global carbon dioxide. That's one of the big so-called greenhouse gases that are targeted by Paris and pretty much every other global warming scheme out there. 15%. Okay. Well, if we cut out all carbon dioxide emissions, that means you end everything that burns CO2. That includes fireplaces, by the way, just burning wood. If you were able to do that, and you're not, you still, by the end of the century, 2100, you would only possibly maybe affect the climate by about 0.2 degrees Celsius, 0.2 of a degree Celsius. Not very impressive. And of course, that's a model going, 80 years in the future. So who knows how accurate these things will actually be. I need to remind people that climatology is an incredibly new science. This is not something we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. This is something we've been dealing with decades. So it's not something you should take as absolute gospel.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the chilling part of this that I think a lot of people don't realize is that humans exhale carbon dioxide as well. And there was part of this that I think was designed to build around the idea of population control. But I think the biggest con that I've run into time and time again is this idea that China and India are emerging nations rather than already established global superpowers economically, because people hear emerging nations, they think of some African country that's finally gotten a democratic government and is trying to scrabble together something that doesn't involve mining for diamonds, and that's not really what this is about, Hayden.
No, and let's not forget, too, what countries we're dealing with, right? China is a communist nation. I don't care how many people say that they've become pseudo-capitalists.
Yeah,
They're a Chinese nation, a communist nation.
Yep.
And we can never trust communists to abide by their word. Never, ever. Remember the Cold War, right? I mean, look, I think the simple fact is with China and the Paris Climate Accord is China will do what's best for China. And if they think that they can get ahead and get paid off, by the way, by signing on to something like this Paris Treaty, they'll do that. It doesn't mean they're going to abide by it like Western nations foolishly will abide by that. My favorite stat, actually, from all of this was India. India said, this is back in 2015, they estimated that in order to get carbon-free, or basically to meet the Paris Treaty's obligations, by 2019 they would need about $2.5 trillion, trillion with a T. And I looked it up. That was about equivalent to the entire GDP of France in 2019.
Holy
so
moly.
you only need to get one France to pay off India, and you're set.
It's crazy. And also a socialist nation. I was talking to Dinesh D'Souza a couple of weeks ago about this, and he says that, Indian socialism is even perhaps more frightening than others. It's built off of a caste system with hard checks on what you're allowed to accomplish and achieve, no matter what you have an ability to do, and it is not a Western democracy the way the United States would imagine it either. But, with the European countries, Hayden, just to refresh folks, went along with this because I think in many cases they wanted the inexpensive materials that China and India are cranking out of their sweatshops and belching smoke in their factories. So they said, well, we'll keep doing this if you keep cranking out cheap widgets for us.
Yeah, I mean, really what you're talking about is geopolitics, right? And it's masquerading as this left-wing, globalist, green ideology that when you really look down beneath it, it all falls apart at the slightest bit of analysis. I remember reading not too long ago that Germany is called the Green Man of Europe, right? Germany imports huge amounts of energy from natural gas from Russia. Right, it's almost its next door neighbor. Right, certainly a big threat to German national security, but they still import a lot of their energy from it. Europe has been able to call itself "quote unquote" green because they say, well, we don't use nearly as much oil and natural gas as the Americans do. But if you break that down, actually, France has been for decades dependent on nuclear power, which the left in this country and in Europe absolutely despise, and that's something that goes back to the old anti-nuclear movement of the 1970s and 80s in the Cold War. That was a total Cold War-oriented thing, not so much an environmental thing. It's been rebranded an environmental thing post-Cold War. But even worse than that, these countries import tons and tons of biofuel. What it is it's basically trees grown in North America that are then chopped down and turned into little pellets.
Oh, yeah,
little wood pellets, and they import these. And you tell me, you put these things on a cargo ship I know those things are not run on electricity, right? They're run on oil and gas, right? They ship these things to Europe, which then burns wood pellets and calls itself greener than the United States. It's just a joke no matter how you look at it. And so, of course, if you follow the money on this stuff, you realize there's bigger things going on. I do think, too, that it's not only about money. I think Europe really does suffer under an ideology that is authoritarian. You mentioned population control. That I've always held that if you follow environmental activism back to its genesis, you end up with Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, let's not forget, she was a major ally with eugenicists, with people who believe we need to forcibly sterilize the quote-unquote unfit to reproduce. This is population control. These people believe there's too many human beings and we need to get rid of them.
And that's really the dirty little secret, Hayden. I was thinking about the pellets, and I chuckled because about 5-6 years ago, Duke Energy determined that trees were not a renewable resource in their pellet burning. Hayden Ludwig is on with us, investigative researcher and journalist for the Capital Research Center. We're talking about Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. The U.S. Year of withdrawal finally came to an end on November 4th. We are out of the Paris Climate Accord, and the United States, NRC, would never permit a building of a nuclear power plant in such a tenuous location as Fukushima, nor to the standards of Chernobyl. And then you look at France, who not only is eating our lunch, but is actually greener than anyone with nuclear energy. They get more bang out of every nuclear buck because I guess they recycle their rods. They've found some way to, reuse spent fuel rods to the point where I was reading something, they get almost 75% of the usable, fissionable energy producing out of each rod. Is that correct?
I couldn't speak to the specifics of the 75%, but yeah, everything you're saying is true. I don't mean to sound like I demonize nuclear. I think nuclear is a fantastic source of energy. And actually, I've read from people who know vastly more than I do about nuclear engineering that places like Fukushima, right, 3 Mile Island, these disasters they keep calling them are actually, if you look at the way they were handled, are evidence that nuclear is very safe. It's handled well. People don't die by the millions like we were told, from the 70s on. I would make the case to you that nuclear power is an awesome option for countries that don't have access to oil and natural gas and coal. And that is why Europe is, especially France, are so dependent on it, because Europe doesn't have a lot of those resources. Coal it does, but it doesn't have a lot of oil and natural gas. It has to import those from most other places. But if you look at it, if you just break down all of the things you'd want in an ideal energy source, you'd want it to be cheap and abundant. You'd want it to be easy to extract. You'd want it to be space efficient, so a liquid is going to be more space efficient than a bunch of rocks like coal, right? All of these different things that when you add them up, you kind of get a sense of the utility of every form of energy. And the irony I always go back to, if you study the history of this environmental stuff, you realize that 100 years ago, when oil was first coming into its own in cars and battleships and all these big things, military is one of the first things to test this out. Oil was actually hailed by all sorts of people in the West as the environmentalist solution to horse poop in the streets, literally, because all of these horses created so much manure that there was a massive public health hazard in every city, every developed city in the world.
Truth.
So, I mean, the irony is cars are actually the thing that saved us from all of the problems of having too much manure piling up elsewhere.
And that's interesting because, and of course, you talk about famine. You talk about, when we talk about population control, we were told there were going to be famines by the time the year 2000 came around. We were going to run out of oil by the year the year 2000 came around. This approach that some small group of people can decide if there's a right number of human souls on this planet is just chilling. You brought up Margaret Sanger. We had a law in Virginia called the Virginia Act for Sterilization that was challenged in the Supreme Court in the Buck versus Bell case, in which the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court issued his ruling saying 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, as if that was his point to decide or not. It's chilling man's inhumanity to man under the guise of a white lab coat.
Yeah, you mentioned the overpopulation stuff too, and the guy who always comes to my mind is Paul Ehrlich, a biologist. He's still around, but his famous thing, people probably remember this, was the population bomb back in late 60s, 1969 or thereabouts. And he thought by the 1980s we'd all be dead, right? And it's funny today, they interviewed him on, I think, like MSNBC or something like that, about 5-10 years ago. And they asked him, well, clearly we're all not dead by the 1980s, 30 years after your prediction. Did you get anything wrong? And he says, my only regret is that I didn't go far enough on all of this stuff. The hubris is just staggering. But one of the things that always stood out to me reading him, and this is not just a wingnut, by the way, he's taken very seriously by the left, is that he believed that the solution to all of these so-called problems was that we need a one-world planetary regime. That's a direct quotation of his writings. We need a one-world planetary regime to redistribute all of the resources nationwide, planet-wide, to everybody as needed, which reminds me of the old Karl Marx adage, right, about, I'm going to forget this now, but to each according to his ability, each according to his need, right?
Right, from each according to his ability, yeah. It is scary, and I've heard from communist apologists saying, well, the problem with communism is it has to exist in a vacuum, because as long as there's anyone who's not living as a communist, then there's going to be people saying, hold it, they're doing better. And it doesn't survive the competition of that. But circling that back to Paris, Hayden, that was sort of the first cornerstone of that New World Order that maybe George H.W. Bush thought would be one based on the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but is clearly becoming much more like the European elitist cabals of Germany and France and even Britain, where a small group of elites dictates to the rest.
Yeah, and it's not over. We should spell that out. We've officially withdrawn, but if you go to the campaign website of Joe Biden, right, it'll tell you day one he plans to get us back in the Paris Climate Accord. And as far as I can tell, there's no reason he can't do that. We could always withdraw at some future point, but what people need to understand is this isn't just something that we get back into it if Joe Biden is elected officially and they conclude that he can put us back in on day one of his inauguration. But even if we withdrew 4 years after that, if a Republican president withdrew from that, that's not over. Every year we would pay in billions and billions of dollars into this green climate fund. I mentioned $2.5 trillion requested by India. They're requesting it through this green climate fund, which is really the most devastating part of Paris. Their goal was to set up this massive global fund into which they would collect about $100 billion every year. Now, the good news is they're nowhere near that. They've got a fraction of that because most countries just don't want to shell out tens of billions of dollars every year. But, of course, the United States probably would. That's the big fear we have to look forward to, is more of your tax dollars going into to pay off these hostile regimes, and all in the name of this green ideology. And ultimately, they want to ban fracking. They want to ban all oil and natural gas. They want us to have net zero emissions in the coming decades. And not only is that not possible, it's incredibly difficult and painful to even attempt that. We should point out that energy is the master resource. Everything is affected by energy. This is not simply your gas tank. Think about how your food is grown. Think about how your food gets to market. Every gallon of milk relies on cheap and abundant energy. So when energy prices go up, everything in your life will go up.
Yes.
And people don't seem to understand this, but your computer, your television, they need to operate at 100% energy input at all times. You can't run a computer with 99% energy input. It just shuts off. And as long as we are dampening the amount of energy we produce, we will never have the access to the kind of things that have made this country so incredibly prosperous and wealthy. And that's what this promises to do. They want to replace reliable sources of energy with these unreliable so-called renewables. And the irony is, if you dig into what these renewables like wind and solar power would do. First of all, they're not reliable. They run massively under 100% reliability, right? Because you don't always have the wind blowing. Most parts of this country are not sunny enough for solar panels to work effectively. Most places are simply not. Florida is not. It's too cloudy, believe it or not. But not only that, the incredible amount of resources that go into this. Putting up a wind turbine, for instance, is hundreds of pounds just in the copper cable that needs to go into wiring these things, let alone all of these thousands of pounds of concrete for the base, all of the steel that goes into running these things. And worse, they have a shelf life of only a few years. And then there are the rotting corpses of these wind turbines, dotted all across the country that you can't reuse. They're just gone.
Yeah.
So it's just they're selling us a pipe dream that will never come true, but will cost us everything we have and more trying to achieve it.
Yeah, and good luck trying to dispose of a solar cell, by the way, because the manufacturer of that puts in things that you need a Superfund site to dispose of, but nobody ever talks about that either. But somehow we're convinced it is green. And Hayden, the idea of zero emissions. As I said, and I just did some quick digging on this, the average human exhales 2.3 pounds of carbon dioxide each day. So what would each human have to do to become zero carbon emitters?
Stop breathing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you laugh, but I think that's some of it. But how many trees? Because the president went so far as to say he's got the Million Trees Initiative. Because if I'm not mistaken, most of our agriculture on this planet actually consumes carbon dioxide.
Well, that's right. I mean, we all learned as children, right? You don't need a degree in science to understand what we learned as children, that plants eat carbon dioxide, CO2. Humans breathe out carbon dioxide, plants breathe it in, and they breathe out oxygen. Everybody knows that. It's one of the first things we learn about biology. It sounds like we're dumbing things down, but it gets as simple as that. I've always been baffled. Well, that's not totally true. I understand why they do it, but I've always found it baffling that ideological leftists insist on demonizing a gas that is absolutely essential to life on Earth. If there was no carbon dioxide on this planet, it would be a dead rock. Nothing would live. And they act as if only burning things, taking things out of the ground and burning them like this, it's this unnatural act. They act like that is somehow polluting Mother Nature. And I just have to wonder, it's something that's naturally occurring. Every time a volcano erupts, CO2 comes out. Every time there's things at the bottom of the ocean, right, that emit CO2. Every time you breathe out, this is all CO2 emitting. It's all purely natural stuff. How can that be a pollutant on our planet? There's actually a lot of evidence that we are living in a CO2-starved era, actually. And I'm not so sure. I can see it both ways, but I think there's a great case to be made when you look at things like back when the dinosaurs were still roaming, there was plenty of CO2 in this planet, and they understand that the flora was enormous, huge ferns, huge trees. Everything was much larger because it was a CO2-rich atmosphere. And then you go to periods with the when the whole world was frozen over, right, in the Great Ice Age of thousands of millions of years ago, right? And they show there was almost no CO2 in the atmosphere. And if you measure the two of them, we're about 400 parts per million right now. We're a lot closer to the Great Ice Age than we are the time of the mega flora of the dinosaurs. I'm not a scientist. I don't know. I'm sure there's arguments other way around, but it's a great argument if you ask me.
Data is data. CapitalResearch.org. Look up Hayden Ludwig. He's also published RealClearEnergy.org. Hayden, thank you so much for your visit this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Great to be with you. Thanks again.
Brenda Tillett is next. Bolster the Blue, and where they stand and where their efforts are to bolster the blue, coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.